PM Sustainable Construction Excellence Center, Construction Research Institute Malaysia as chair, and Sri Kamal Kishore, member NDMA India as co-chair. The speakers of the session may kindly join the chair and co-chair. Mr. Andrew Maskrey, Risk Nexus Initiative, Professor Bilal Ayyub, Center for Technology and System Management, University of Maryland, Mr. Edward Charles Anderson, Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist, World Bank, and Professor Ravi, Sinha, Department of Civil Engineering, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, India. I request the chair to kindly take over the session for further deliberations.
All right, okay, thank you very much. Friends, dear friends, I would like to thank you, the organizer, for having me chair this session. Now, we are now in the technical session 2A on risk assessment. Basically, this session will draw upon the sectoral case studies as discussed in technical session 1, and we will focus on the practice of disaster risk assessment as it relates to the identification and development of critical infrastructure. Case studies in this session will address the following questions. 1, what are the major challenges in incorporating new disaster risk assessment practices as part of the country's infrastructure investment approval process? Number 2, what new methods are being explored globally for quantifying uncertainty due to climate change? Number 3, how can countries organize a system of continually updating risk assessment across different scales that will inform future development? And the last, how can effective communication be facilitated between policymakers, infrastructure developers, regulators, and the general public regarding the finding of risk assessments? And I have with me I will be assisted by Mr. Kamal Kishore from NDMA of India. And maybe I'll pass the mic to Mr. Kamal, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope the coffee has woken you all up, and when Andrew begins to speak, you'll all begin to get sleepless nights. So, but I just wanted to say that when we were putting together this session, there were a lot of requests from countries, participants to talk about this topic. So this is going to be a slightly oversubscribed session. And the organizers have decided that the following session, 17:45 to 18:15 cross-country panel, we will take it as the first thing tomorrow morning. So this is the last session. And the earlier session when we discussed the 3 sectors, disaster control, infrastructure, energy, and transport, almost all the speakers talk about risk assessments in one form or the other, challenges with it, and from the sort of the narrow confines of disaster risk management as a practice, and when you begin to look at the sectors, the whole practice of risk assessment has become very sophisticated. We are talking about systems of systems approach. We are talking about scenario building for dealing with uncertainties. We are looking at consequence analysis, not just looking at the direct impacts, the whole cascading impacts. So it is a very important area of work to actually begin to inform all the infrastructure development with sophisticated risk assessments and not just looking at risk in isolation at the asset level. So with that, I would now invite Andrew Maskrey. He needs no introduction. He's done 6 or 7 maybe global reports on disaster risk to present his perspective on the topic.
Okay, thank you, Kamal. Coming towards the end of the afternoon and having had so many excellent presentations beforehand, inevitably some of what I'm going to say has already been touched on by other participants, but I think this is a great opportunity to bring together some of those different strands into sort of one coherent whole as we really talk about how we can use risk models and risk metrics to bring together disaster and climate risk investments. This, I mean, I think this was even in Kamal's presentation in the morning. It was a different bridge and a different picture. But what we're talking about here is if we are going to be investing, I mean, the figures that were coming around when the SDGs were approved, around $90 trillion in new global infrastructure between now and 2030, unless we can actually get this risk-informed. We're talking about investing $90 trillion in new disasters and new broken bridges. So that doesn't do anyone any good. When we talk about impacts, I think it's useful to break that up into a number of different sectors and segments. Certainly in our work, we normally differentiate between the direct losses, in this case would be loss of infrastructure, the indirect impacts on flows, revenue from that infrastructure, the wider knock-on impacts, which can also be on social sectors such as health and education, and the macroeconomic effects. And I'll be using that classification as I go through the presentation. Again, some of this repeats some of the stuff we heard in the morning, but I mean, in terms of direct losses, Asia Pacific between 2001 and 2016, these are from Kamal's figures. Damage and loss represented around, infrastructure represented around 8 to 13% of total loss and 17 to 66% of fiscal loss. That's the loss which governments are responsible for. But if you dig down into national disaster loss databases, which pick up all the losses, not just from the intensive disasters, but from the extensive ones as well, you can really see the extent of what we're talking about. Cambodia, you know, over 7,000 kilometers of road damage since 2000. That actually represents 42% of the road network. Indonesia, a much larger country, over 100,000 kilometers damaged. And then when we do talk about very intensive disasters, last year between August and October, I was working back in Peru after a long time, and we had what was probably in 2017 the worst ever ENSO, El Nino event. And just one single event, you know, represented again over 3,000 kilometers of roads that damaged, 300 bridges destroyed, and direct losses equivalent to around 72% of the total public investment in infrastructure executed in 2016. So all very, very good reasons why we need to make sure that all our new infrastructure is risk and risk informed. In terms of the indirect losses, back in the days when our team was coordinating the global assessment report, we did quite a large survey of small and medium enterprises. And again, most of the disruptions that I experienced or were concerned about were infrastructure related, you know, power, water, telecoms, and supply chains. And in terms of the macroeconomic impacts, again, this mirrors some of the work that Takea presented in the morning, very negative long-term impacts on GDP growth. So what I'm going to talk about now is really how we can use modeling and metrics and I think in a fairly structured way to start really addressing that. And I think what I'm saying using it, I'm really probably thinking about the audience of, you know, upper middle, lower middle, and low income countries, which I'm used to working in. The first thing we really need to do is think about how we can start off with a national risk profile, a multi-hazard risk profile. So something that's not necessarily at this point tied down to a single piece of infrastructure or a single sector. We use probabilistic models simply because it's the only way of capturing long return period events. So that's 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 year events, which cannot be captured through, you know, deterministic or simple statistical models. So what's on the slide here is a fairly, you know, conventional way of going about probabilistic modeling. It's the same methodology that's been used by the insurance industry for 20 or 25 years. But the key here is not to do it like the insurance industry does. The key here is to actually produce open models, open source models, which are available for governments, infrastructure companies, the private sector, and others to make decisions. We produce several metrics with the model. The most common one is average annual loss. This isn't a measure of historical loss, nor is what you're going to necessarily lose next year. It's a variable which really looks at how you annualize in an average out the long-term risk. So think about this in terms of how much money, in a sense, if I'm a country or a sector in a country, I should, in a sense, be putting under the mattress every single year to cover my future losses. Globally, and this is just the built environment and just rapid onset hazards, we're in a world of probably around $300 billion a year of annual average loss. So that's, again, around 5% of that expected annual global investment in infrastructure. So do we want to be losing at least 5% of what we're actually investing every year? We also, at the national level, need to look at the implications for sustainable development. And this goes beyond just saying impacts on specific SDGs. Because if you take your annual average loss and you look at it as a ratio with respect to what the country is investing in terms of capital investment or social expenditure, you come to the conclusion that the higher your risk, the less you're going to be able to invest in the future or maintain or increase your social expenditure or capital investment. And capital investment is, of course, infrastructure. So just a couple of examples from countries in this region. The average annual loss as a percentage of capital investment, Myanmar 27%, Philippines 13%, and in terms of social expenditure, far higher, an extraordinary 120% in Myanmar and 94% in Philippines. Very, very difficult to sustain over the long term. But ultimately, we need to come up with a national risk profile. This is Cambodia, where we can see geographically where the risks are concentrated. Cambodia is mainly flood risk. That's a 1 in 1,000 year, very extreme flooded area map. And with not just the annual average loss, but the kind of probable maximum losses which we could have for different return periods. And what that really means in dollar terms for the government, in terms of what it means for GDP, in this case around 2% of GDP a year, what it means in terms of social expenditure, capital investment. Can the government cover high losses? In this case, there'll be a financing gap for any event over a 20-year return period. And at the national level, this is where we really think the governments need to start defining what we could call resilient targets. If our AAL is currently 2% of GDP, maybe we should have a target by 2030 to reduce the annual average loss to less than 0.5%. And these kind of national level targets, I think, could easily be married with some of the, let's say, carbon negativity targets that Aramar was talking about in the previous session. And then we really need to integrate that properly into public and private investment planning, evaluation in the central government, something that's been done quite well now in a number of Latin American countries, because this cannot stay in the terms of one-off projects or one-off exercises. It's something that needs to get systematically put into the basic mechanisms of government resource allocation and project and program evaluation. So that's really our first level, national real risk profiling. A second level, as far as we can see, is then modeling risk in specific infrastructure sectors. And I've taken here just the example of the electricity sector because it mirrors a program we're currently working on with a large electricity infrastructure provider. So obviously here we need to move from an approach that just looks at physical components or infrastructure elements in isolation. We do need to look at that, but we also need to then look at the system approach. The interrelationship between the elements, the operational paths, the amount of redundancy, and how we can actually estimate interruptions. And that means looking not just at the direct loss, which would be the replacement cost of specific elements of infrastructure, but really the indirect loss, which is, in this case, would be the difference between the capacity of an undamaged and the capacity of a damaged or perturbed system. Very important, we need to take a multi-hazard approach. So we need to look at multiple event scenarios from multiple hazards. And when we do this probabilistically, this means building up a very, very large set of event scenarios, a synthetic set of event scenarios, each one which will have different types of disturbance on the system as a whole. And following the sort of risk estimation logic. Each of these estimations has a loss attached to it, and we can then build up a loss exceedance curve for the system as a whole. We need to factor in climate change. A lot of risk models as they are now are still done with today's climate. But again, using a probabilistic approach is not difficult. It's actually reasonably straightforward to do, to simply take today's climate out of the equation and punch in tomorrow's climate, whichever climate change scenario we want to use, or multiple climate change scenarios. And when we've done that, it's possible to actually see how your average annual loss can change, by how much it changes in how many years, which also then starts giving you that actually a dollar value to the additionality of climate change, whether that's due to an increase in flooded areas due to sea level rise, as you can see in the left-hand maps, or whether it's due to wind damage, as an exercise we did in the Caribbean on the right. Where the modeling then gets interesting is how we actually start using the metrics to actually take decisions about what to do about the risk in an infrastructure sector or multiple infrastructure sectors. When you look at risk models, and it's common really across all the hazards, as the hazard increases in intensity, the risk is due more to the exposure, that's literally just where it's located, and less to the vulnerability. Until you actually could get to the point where the risk almost becomes, or say the vulnerability almost becomes a binary function. Now this has very important implications for what we can actually do about the risk. We could have ultimately infinite resilience, but it would be infinitely costly. We can't often change the exposure. I mean, we can't move cities, we can't necessarily move highway networks, we can't move infrastructure networks to other places. We can reduce the vulnerability. But it's much easier and more effective to reduce the vulnerability to the less intense hazards, to the more intense hazards. So this really has to do with defining our risk appetite, because it's impossible to reduce all the risks. So having a loss exceedance curve, a proper curve developed for the sector, allows us to define what our risk appetite is. Is it a 100-year return period, a 200 return period, a 500-year return period? What those probabilities mean, and what sort of losses and loss reduction that means for us. Again, taking the current risk in a sector, looking at our resilient target, how much we actually want to sort of move the curve downwards and to the left. We can then look at the range of different alternatives we have available to us, which can include structural measures, whether those are stronger standards for new infrastructure, assessments to retrofit critical infrastructure, again, maybe introducing green engineering and green technology, financial measures, risk transfer instruments and estimating those costs, but also importantly, and this we've seen again in the work we've been doing on the electrical infrastructure, contingency planning. The risk assessment actually allows you to have almost real-time early warning. And real-time early warning can often make the difference between actually maintaining a system at least semi-operational or complete knockout. So we have possibilities to reduce our direct loss, our net loss, as well as our system performance. And then we really need to assess the costs for each of these options and for each level of resilience. So coming back to what in the morning was described as disaster control infrastructure, this is just a hypothetical example. I mean, just say in terms of flood mitigation infrastructure, if we currently had a 1-meter flood defense wall in a city, if we wanted to build that up to 2 meters, it maybe would cost us $30 million extra and could reduce our annual average loss in 10 million. By the time we'd increased the wall to 3 meters, the cost may have gone up to 120 million and would reduce the AAL by 20 million. So when we start talking about costs and benefits and standards, this is where we also get really into the realms of political decision making, because there's no such thing as a perfect standard. Standards actually have to do with our risk appetite, our availability of resources, and how much risks we're actually willing and able to reduce. This is a real example I just couldn't resist taking the picture of. This is behind my house last week when Storm Eleanor came through France. There's actually a flood retention pond behind my house, I think designed for a 100-year event. Looking at how full it was, I think this was probably a 20-year event in my house. Fortunately, didn't get flooded. And then we really need to look at the cost effectiveness of how much to invest in the risk reduction, how much in the transfer, and how much we leave as residual risk, which we have to deal with other measures such as early warning and response. And again, coming back to one of the earlier slides, it's generally, let's say, the less intensive layers of risk, which is more cost effective and easy to reduce. The middle levels, which is more cost effective to actually transfer to the insurance or the capital markets, and there will always be residual risk, which we can't deal with in either of those ways. So just to finalize, as I said, if we were going to talk to a government and discuss almost, say, from point zero, how to go about this, we'd really propose let's say, a three-pronged approach. Starting with a national multi-hazard risk profile, which is really, again, where we would probably like to be talking to a very, very central government ministry, like a finance or a planning ministry. We'd then need, high-resolution infrastructure sector risk models, where we'd be talking to particular line ministries or subnational governments, if it's for particular regions. And then looking at this whole issue of risk layers, standards, costs and benefits and trade-offs between different elements of a risk management strategy. This is really where we get down to the level of utility companies and infrastructure operators. Someone was asking me in the break about the sort of systems of systems approach. And clearly, I think this is a very attractive approach, probably for high-income countries. I'm not sure in some of the countries where we work, low and low middle-income countries, whether it might be the equivalent of putting a sort of a Rolls-Royce engine into a Mini. That's something we'd actually have to look at. But I think we need to here somehow combine a sort of a top-down approach, as I said, starting with multi-hazard risk profiles, but also bearing in mind that in many low and middle-income countries, when we come down to the local government level, and local governments who ultimately are responsible for local water systems, rural roads, local drainage systems, etc. A lot of these municipalities really still have major difficulties still collecting the garbage. So before we sort of get too carried away with the very, very sophisticated approaches, we think about our audience carefully as well. That's all for me. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andrew. A lot of thought-provoking ideas as to what may be practical in terms of a risk assessment framework in the first place, and how we cannot talk about standards in an absolute sense, but we have to really look at what is the kind of risk context, what is the kind of development context we are dealing with. We'll come back to some of the points you raised, but let me now first invite Professor Bilal Ayyub from University of Maryland to share his thoughts.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Mr. Kamal, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. My first time to India. And what I'm going to do today is cover coastal infrastructure and network resilience. And in particular, we'll be looking at measurements and metrics. As you know, engineering design philosophy evolved over the years, starting from factor of safety type of thinking, followed by reliability-based design, then risk-informed design, and certainly resilience is the next logical progression. Risk looks at the likelihood and the consequences, and really deals with the recovery aspects of things, while resilience will take it to the recovery part. So I'm going to focus on measurement science and metrics related to resilience. Basically, I'm going to start with some background to show the US coastal exposure to storms and so on. Then we'll discuss what's the meaning of resilience, and I will spend very little time on that, but I'll set the basis for measurement. Measurement requires a suitable notional definition. Then I'm going to provide examples related to recovery and recovery profiles. Then I'm going to discuss natural systems and nature-based infrastructure. and then network resilience, primarily transportation, then identify some research needs and concluding remarks. In terms of coastal exposure in the US East Coast, this table here shows basically in here by state, what's the exposure and what's the percent which is in the coastal area. And you can see the state of Florida, 79% is in the coastal zone, and the average is 37%. Now, in terms of dollar amounts, this amount about $10 trillion based on 2012 figures. Now, what is resilience? In the US, the most accepted and commonly referenced definition is the definition provided in the 2013 Presidential Policy Directive. This is the PBD 21. Basically, the term resilience means the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. The Army Corps has a slightly different definition, and then the classic definition, which is commonly cited, is the one by Holing, which is in ecology in 1973. Resilience determined the persistence of relationships within a system. I thought, typically when I deal with definitions, the minute I start to see a long list, like what's in this presidential directive definition, I get concerned. Is this list complete? So usually I prefer simpler definitions, and I thought the resilience of a system is the persistence of its function. I mean, this will capture it pretty much, and that's the definition that we are adopting here. Now, if I look at performance, which is the basis for measuring resilience, you know, when we quantify resilience, we need to identify, well, what is the function of the system and how to measure its performance. So let's say in here, what you see is a curve that shows performance on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. We have a design level, which is this horizontal line. Typically, there might be aging, which could degrade the performance of the system. Then there are disruptions that are random in nature. It could be a stochastic process that's stationary or non-stationary if I'm dealing with a changing climate. Some of these events could lead to a disruption. Not every event will lead to a disruption of the system. So I'm showing an event in here that actually disrupts the system. Then there will be some emergency response period followed by recovery. The disruption could take various profiles from brittle-like failure, ductile or graceful failure. And the recovery could be recovering to as good as old or as good as new or better than new, and anything in between with various shapes to those curves. Now, what I'm after is measuring resilience. How can I quantify resilience? There are two approaches. The first approach, which is based on average time to failure, is almost similar to what we do in reliability engineering. So I could say, well, here is the total time on the average for a cycle of use as well as disruption. Part of this total time is functioning, and part of it is failed. So if I take how much functioning divided by the total time, I will get some notional metric in here, which is similar to availability. But then there is complications to it because I have to account for those curves. And this could be accounted for through integrations under the curves. So this is one model which could be used for quantifying resilience. Now, what is performance, which appears in the vertical axis? Performance will depend on the system. If I'm dealing with a transportation road, it could be a throughput of traffic. If I'm dealing with water treatment plant, the same thing. It could be volume per day, and so on. If I'm dealing with community, for example, it could be economic output of the community, or it could be consumption level, which indicates the quality of life. So basically, performance needs to be defined. A system might have more than one performance types, which is okay. In a recent study that was done for the LA Water District, performance for the water distribution system was defined by three things. One is water available for fire, and water available to household, and quality of water, and they are all dealing with the same system. So there might be more than one performance measure. Another way of measuring resilience quantitatively is if I consider the same figure as before, but I'm not considering aging, just to simplify things. And I consider a planning horizon, T. This could be 100 years, or any period of interest, the design life of the structure. And here is the disruption. And of course, I could have any number of disruptions throughout its life. So what I'll end up doing is calculating basically resilience as the sum of the chances of having so many events within life times the probability of failure times how much performance loss I'll get. The performance loss is given by the area of this wedge. Every time there is a disruption, I lose a wedge from this large rectangle in here, which is 100% all the way to the the planning horizon. So I'm losing wedges of it, and I could account for that probabilistically and calculate the total area. Now, I could simplify that equation. Actually, I was after coming up with a closed form expression, simple equation without an infinite sum in here. But you could take that equation and write it in this form, which is straightforward, just direct substitution. We published that recently in the papers noted in here. Now, the failure, the profile, the failure as well as the recovery, this could be changed from linear to single step or multi-step. So it's not really limited to this form. I'm just using it here as an example. Now, we used this model for 3 case studies. One, the recovery profile of the city of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I'm sure most of you maybe are familiar with the city. The city is below sea level. Here is the profile of the city, cutting from, according to this figure, which shows the Gulf of Mexico on the top there and the Mississippi River at the bottom. And if you take a cross-section from point A to B, that's what you'll see. A is the river, which is higher than the lake, which is connected to the Gulf, and that is B in here. And the city, the downtown area, and so on, falls in here. So basically what you have is a basin. We did an elaborate study for the Army Corps shortly after the event to determine what's the level of protection we should have of this for the city. Now, the inundation that resulted from the breach was a flooded area as big as the UK, just to give you an idea about the scale, and resulted in tremendous losses, as well as about 2,000 people who died. Now, if I'm interested in recovery of the entire city, the best way to do it is really through economic terms. So this one, what it shows in here is GDP by region indexed to the 2001. So I took basically the city of New Orleans and the national GDP, and I pinned them to 100 at the beginning of 2001. Then I tracked them. You could see that the city which is the gray line, and the US is the blue line, you could see the city was performing better than the US trend. And when the event happened in 2005, it declined. So the question becomes a judgment call. Well, how long did I go in the future before I declare that the two are basically the city is becoming outperforming the national average, similar to what we had at the time when the event happens. So the duration of recovery, I'll say it's maybe 8 years. Another way of looking at recovery of a community is the number of people. The city of New Orleans had 1 million people, and until now it did not really recover its entire population. It's back to about 650,000. But the population size, I'm not sure if it's a good indicator, because the industry mix and the employment needs changed after the event. So I think throughput economics would be maybe more suitable. But if you look at the result in here, I could say what we have is linear recovery. I mean, linear approximation will capture this. Another example is recovery profile of a bridge failure. There is one of the major highways that runs east-west in the United States, and it goes through Minnesota, is Highway 35 West. And there was a bridge collapse, which was initiated by fatigue cracking. It was a truss bridge, and you could see in here, sorry about that, you could see in here how the failed bridge, it was a total catastrophic collapse, killing several people, and then the new bridge after it was built. This bridge was investigated quickly in order to rebuild it. So the investigation period, the forensics, as well as the reconstruction required about 1 year. In this case, a single step representation for recovery profile will be suitable. So I have now linear recovery profile and single step, since we don't really we will not open a bridge if it is partially completed. It has to be fully completed. Now, if I look at 9/11, before and after, that one has its own complications in terms of recovery. First, there were disputes, legal disputes between the Port Authority and the developer, and this took several years until they were resolved, until 2006. The event was in 2001. And then it took 13 years to have the first tower open, and then it's followed by other towers. So the recovery profile could be represented in terms of performance or use of the land as multi-step recovery profile. Now, in terms of solutions, if I'd like to enhance resilience, what can be done about it? I could say there are two main categories in here. There is the hardening the system, which could be land use policies, system design, technologies, or soft solutions, which could be natural and nature-based solutions. These are like dunes and barrier islands and so on. Insurance and insurance securities. We've done some work recently for the Army Corps on nature and nature-based infrastructure. And we've done also another study on insurance. Basically, it's towards resilience to commercial nuclear power plant accidents. And we introduced what's called a nuclear liability via catastrophe risk bonds. And there are others. There could be social programs and societal measures and so on. Now, the two solutions, they have unique characteristics to some extent. The engineered or hardening the system is less affordable because usually it's costly, but it's more effective. The ecosystem-based solution could be more affordable, less cost, but not as effective. But then there are the co-benefits that come with the ecosystem type of solution. The co-benefits could be basically better sustainability for the community. It could enhance the environment and so on. Now, these are examples of coastal infrastructure that we examined for the Army Corps, beaches and dunes, marshes, and so on. You could just you could look at those. These are including levees and drainage and pumping stations when we deal with New Orleans, man-made barrier islands, as well as natural but enhanced barrier islands. Now, if I focus if I just provide you examples about the performance measures related to natural and nature-based features. We have dunes and beaches. Let's say if I'd like to measure the performance of dunes and beaches, we identified several of them, such as berm height and width, beach slope, sediment grain size and supply, and so on. Vegetated features, which is also an example of nature-based coastal infrastructure. It could be the type of vegetation, the health of it, the continuity of it, and so on. Now, additionally, if I consider performance as a function of time, which is what you see in this figure, basically the vertical axis shows the level of performance when the system was started at a level of 1. And you could see the random events that cause disruption. The problem with coastal infrastructure, sometimes they don't really recover quickly on their own. They require enhancements by putting resources in, but they could recover on their own. And you could see in here that if I have too many storms, the following storm could hit before we have the full recovery, and so on until there is a breach in a barrier island, as an example, where we have to go and build it up, possibly to to better than what it used to be or what it was designed for. I'm shifting to another item, which is an ongoing work on the resilience of networks. The focus in here is the impact of an increase in sea level, or to make it broadly as water level. Water level includes surges and waves and so on. the impact of that on a metro system. And the focus is in two areas. One is Shanghai, and the other one is Washington, D.C. Both cities are vulnerable to water level increases. The Shanghai work is being done in collaboration with Tongji University in Shanghai, and the Washington, D.C. work is done at the University of Maryland. So basically, we started by looking at tunnels as one of the key links in there, and we produced some models for quantifying the resilience of tunnels. Then we examined the system through the network details, the interconnectedness of the various stations, and the network vulnerability. And then we examined flooding of metro station entrances and exits as there is a higher water level. We were lacking some data in the Shanghai metro in terms of height of the elevation of exits and entrances, and we had a team of students who went to all the metro stations, 300 of them, and they actually gathered the information that we need. Well, here is some results based on the Shanghai metro. There are 300 stations. Just to give you a sense of size, this is about half the size of the New York metro system, and it's about three times the Washington, D.C. metro system. It's quite sizable, it's growing, it's shallow tunneling, high water table, very vulnerable to sea level rise. So basically, we could quantify vulnerabilities that account for how much each node is connected to the other nodes. So there are indicators for that, and we are doing something similar for Washington, D.C. And then we examined the loss of particular stations. What if this station, the one on Century Avenue, is lost, and how would it affect the whole network in terms of performance? Then we examined recovery sequences. How should I recover this station? Should it be recovered by line 2694 or 2649? What's the order, the best order? And this all was done in economic terms, as you see at the figure on the bottom. Now, in terms of increased water level, here is the 4 degrees centigrade warming and the 2-degree warming, and you could see the images behind them, how the city will be flooded. Even with the Paris Agreement, there will be significant flooding in Shanghai without taking some action. Now we examined, again, what's the elevation of exits and entrances of the metro system in Shanghai, and the figure that you see on your right-hand side, it shows the elevation and the frequency, how many stations fall at. And so you could see that a good number of them, it doesn't take, it's in meters, so if there is a surge, with a storm and so on, it could flood those stations. This shows the inundation map with the location of the stations, and it shows the breakdown of how many will be flooded as we increase the water level. Now, the Washington, D.C. area, we did some inundation maps as what you see in here. If you're familiar with the Washington, D.C., this will be basically the White House is somewhere in here. The White House is over here, and the Capitol is here, and the Washington Monument on the other side. And you can see, this is the worst case of getting a 4 to 5, I'll say, meter water level. And the flooding, what's interesting in how the city will flood, in the sense that first the national airport will be flooded, and then the water will start to come from this end, and the Army Corps build a levee in here. But then eventually the water, even with the levee, the water will start to loop the other way around. And what you have in here is almost an island that will form. The Washington Monument will be on dry ground. The U.S. Capitol is in dry ground. And our president will see water from the windows, right? So that's what we did in here is basically as the sea level goes up, we calculated what's the losses in billions of dollars. That's what we were after at the very end. This was picked up by the about 300 media channel, this figure, and it was cited all over in not necessarily scientific literature, but in media channels to the public. At the very end, to decide what we should do, we have to use economics. And basically, if I take the figure that I discussed previously, and with the color coding, And I could say there are 3 curves in here. One is the red curve, which is the property damage, direct and life loss, direct and indirect. I have recovery cost, and I have a curve in between, which is loss of functionality, loss of use. So it's almost as if you have an uninsured car, and you'll have an accident, you lose your car, you have to buy a new car, and you have to lease a car. So I mean, these are basically the 3 curves. Now, what you should account in the calculations will depend on the perspective. And an Army Corps economist will not consider all of this. An insured property will not consider all of this. An insurer will look at it differently. But these are the 3 curves that we are dealing with. One of the things that's commonly done is people calculate the benefit to cost ratio, but my biggest concern in there is when the benefit to cost ratio is calculated as a deterministic quantity based on best estimate or average estimates. Ideally, it should be calculated in the form of a probability. What's the probability that, which is what you see at the bottom, the probability that the benefit to cost will exceed 1, which means what's the probability that the benefit will be realized? So in here, I'm not only accounting for the mean value, but I'm accounting for the standard deviation, the distribution type. If we have a simulation model that's doing the inundation and the calculations of the economics associated with it, we certainly have full distributions for the losses. And if I have that, similarly, I could get full distribution for the cost, because always the cost, we'll find that it does require more resources than what we planned for, but there is uncertainty in it, and hence we could calculate it in this manner. Recently, we did a project for the Department of Commerce, collaborating with one of their economists, Stanley Gilbert, and we had a paper on models for the economics of resilience. Now, this model, the probabilistic model for benefit to cost ratio, is covered in my textbook on risk analysis in engineering and economics, the 2nd edition. Now, as concluding remarks, I could say that in order to have suitable metrics, we have really to engage formally in measurement science. Measuring anything requires by an appropriate notional definition. So we have to start with the definition and then tie it, then basically use it as a basis for measurement. When I come up with a measurement, measuring in this case resilience, I do impose conditions on the metric. In the paper that shows in here, the very first paper, the 2014 Systems Resilience for Multi-Hazard Environment Definition, Metrics, and Valuation, that's the way I treat it. There are 10 conditions that I impose in measuring resilience that I must meet in order to have an appropriate measure. And that's what I shared with you today. Then dealing with the profile, loss recovery profile, my advice is really to keep it simple for those recovery profile. It will be very difficult to justify nonlinear curves and things of this type. I think linear, single step, multi-step will end up meeting a lot of the needs. Economic resilience should account
Professor, maybe if you can help us manage time.
Sure. Economics of resilience is certainly will require considering uncertainties. And that's what I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bilal. There was a lot in there. We will come back to it. In the meantime, I will invite Edward to talk about the bank experience in this area.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak to you this evening. I'm based in Tanzania as a senior disaster risk management specialist. So I'm really here to share some of my own reflections and experience applying risk assessments in Africa primarily, but I've also merged this presentation with my colleagues from the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which work with a lot of risk assessments worldwide. And so without regurgitating the theory, I did want to highlight a few elements of the concepts of risk assessment and the approaches that I think are important when we talk about applying them, particularly in our client countries, in low-capacity environments. What some of the available tools are, and some reflections on the questions that have been posed to us. So I like this stylized image because it very clearly represents a risky situation. risk is the possibility of disaster, of course, as we've heard a lot, but I think this also shows that risk is man-made. And that's really important to keep in mind, especially for many of the situations we face. And I think partly because it's in human nature that out of sight is out of mind. We tend to forget the things we can't see. So even a city like New Orleans, even a planned low-income environment or neighborhood that was well known to be below the water level of Lake Charles, that there were conditions that were expected when, not if, for a hurricane-prone city, could still be called an act of God when it happened. Politicians, leaders, citizens were surprised, and we shouldn't be surprised. So I think a big challenge of risk assessment is how do we develop that evidence base, that understanding of the situation we live in, especially when we're talking about fast-growing, informal, low-income, low-resource cities, right? So a generation ago, many towns and cities in moderately seismic areas were 50,000 population, 1 or 2 story buildings of mud or brick construction. And, you know, over the last few generations, these have grown up to be 10, 12 story places. And people don't understand the risk that we're building as we go up the structures and the need to invest in seismic resistance, the need to understand those critical facilities. So risk is an invisible condition that we live with, and a disaster is simply the materialization of that risk. So I think it really helps us to understand a risk assessment as a tool by which we monitor and assess the development planning process. And a disaster simply is a failure of that planning process. So it bears emphasizing every time, disasters are not natural, hazards might be natural. So the risk assessment process, especially from the engineering perspective, and I think we've heard from both our previous presenters in this session, you know, it's a way of representing the world. We can break it down into nice, simple, modular concepts. The hazard assessment, we'll pick a parameter that we want to really link to an element exposed by some vulnerability function. But even this sort of simplified representation of the world is quite nuanced. I mean, we have to pick the right intensity parameter. Most wind hazards pick the 3-second gust, which is appropriate for light structures and houses, but an engineer building a bridge will ask you for the 10-minute wind. You know, if you're modeling floods, do you want flood duration, flood depth, water flow? It depends whether you're modeling crops or housing damage or infrastructure damage. So assessing the impacts, even the physical risk, there's a whole science, a techno-scientific discipline that we've heard about from our 2 previous presenters to it. And you have this rather simplified, very nice, I think very appropriate methodology that we need to be applying systematically. One caveat I would hold is that sometimes we may not see the forest for the trees. We may focus on the wrong element exposed. When I first started working 12, 13 years ago in Belize, one story was told to me of a risk reduction measure where indigenous communities in the south of the country had concrete houses built for them to be hurricane shelters, and they were surprised to find that actually the community was storing their grain harvest in the houses and continuing to live in their traditional thatched roofs during the hurricane, and that was simply because they valued that grain harvest more than their own house. So sometimes the socio-cultural conditions are really important to ask the right questions before we set up our models. Also, when it comes to developing countries and much of the world we live in, it's also the formality of that system, right? So it tends towards complexity and chaos very quickly when we look at the real world. Is never quite the modeled world. Compliance with building codes is not just about what do you build, where do you build, but how do you build it, and how did your neighbor build it, and how might that affect you? In Dar es Salaam, where I live, we have a massive unplanned westerly expansion of the city, and that is causing a huge amount of deforestation and sediment erosion that is affecting the flood risk in the eastern outlet of the river. So this slide comes from GFDRI. It's really a decision tree to show that a risk assessment is not much more than an evidence base to inform a decision. So the risk assessment by itself is useless if no decisions are being taken. So actionable tools, actions is really what we care about, and we should start off with what decisions are to be informed. And there really is a hierarchy from the abstract sort of portfolio level or national level contingent liability. Where are the main sources of risk? What are we trying to decide? How much contingency, how much risk do we hold? How much do we transfer? What Andrew was really presenting. But we can work down the layers, down the sectors, all the way down to asset level risks. as well as future risk prevention in terms of hazards for climate scenarios, as Andrew also mentioned. So this is really the risk assessment typically picks this metric of expected losses, can be represented normally in dollars, sometimes in people affected in other measures, and it tends towards physical losses, although not necessarily. And then we have this notion of resilience that I won't have all the equations that we just saw from Professor Ayyub, but really this ability to cope with a shock, right? And so we care about the system and the systems approach. We care about redundancies. We care about coping capacities. So I'll give you an example of the different disciplines involved. This is the Iceland volcano eruption in 2010. I can't pronounce the name of the volcano. But some very clever volcanologists did manage to create a hazard map. This is the ash cloud of the volcano covering the North Atlantic. And you can also see on this the main transatlantic flight routes. Now, most volcanologists are probably not aware of air traffic control regulations on extended twin operations. But what it means is that twin engine aircraft are not allowed to fly any further south because they have to fly within certain range of land. So there was no redundancy really in the system. There was no ability, even though planes could technically fly the lower route. Very few of the planes operated by airlines could get out of the range of the cloud. So the impact here was not damage to planes, although people postulated the ash cloud would affect engines. All the planes were grounded. The impact was 107,000 flights grounded, almost 50% of air traffic, 10 million passengers stranded, 130 million pounds per day cost to the airlines, none of that really being compensated to passengers, with all sorts of secondary cascade effects in terms of institutions, teachers, doctors being stranded. Even the Kenyan economy, which is 20% based on exports to European markets of perishable goods, had major effects. So we've heard about also this morning the global connected world that we live in. But
Edward,
this is just
maybe if you can wrap up quickly.
Really? Okay. So the emphasis is really, it's not just about infrastructure damage, the hardware, but also the software, the services. And there are innovations in resilience. So what the World Bank has been doing with countries is really these portfolio level reviews of risk assessment at the national level. Kenya looking at where the major sources are from floods and droughts. In Afghanistan, also looking at earthquakes and identifying the impact on GDP, on population, on critical facilities. In Kyrgyzstan, you can take it down a level and look at specific facilities that are considered critical, schools, hospitals, roads, map where they are. And if you only have budget to support or retrofit 10, 20% of your schools, you can begin to rank, well, which 10%, in which districts, in which communities, how should we prioritize the budget? What are the interventions that have a positive cost benefit or return on investment? This risk assessment was looking at road network in Mozambique, and it's really two elements in parallel. One is the effect of floods on the road network, but not so much the cost of rehabilitating the road or reconstructing the road, but the cost in economic terms per vehicle to taking alternate routes. So looking at the mobility as a service cost, and then comparing that to the criticality. Well, what does that mean if you're in a very poor neighborhood? What does that mean if you're in a market-dependent village or town where you have to get your goods to market? So in parallel to the risk assessment in terms of dollars per vehicle, we were looking at poverty and agriculture and fisheries activities to come up with a sort of combined risk and criticality matrix for which districts would need most help during the flood season. I'll skip this. When you break it down to the asset level, it really pays to invest in data. So the error bars that you get at the portfolio level are tolerable. In the case of Mozambique, we can see very wide error bars on our return on investment, which is okay over a portfolio. But of course, when you're going to build a bridge, an extra meter or two can translate into millions of dollars, an extra meter of depth of dredging, for example. So here we really need topographic data, hydrographic data, rainfall data, and it pays to have customized risk assessments for specific critical infrastructure. I'll move quickly to the concluding remarks then. So in order to prevent future creation of risks, the philosophy really of GFDR and the World Bank is to make data accessible, low cost, low complexity. So tools such as Think Hazard try to formulate a hierarchy of hazards that you need to think about when planning a project or an investment. So Think Hazard is at thinkhazard.org. You pick a country such as Thailand, you can see the major hazards, and it gives you a lot of information, for example, cyclones, which districts, which communities, what recommendations, and where to go for more information. It is not a risk assessment, it's a decision-making guide into which risk assessments you need to think about. So this chart from GFDRI really breaks that down into the hierarchy of decisions where you approach it. Most risk assessments end up in some form being a spatial data management project of some kind. So having data that's easy to find, easy to organize, easy to share are part of the toolkit here. Then filtering and screening for climate hazards for the right kinds of questions to ask is then sort of early in that information chain before you start picking an analytical tool. And you can have tools that work with crude, simple deterministic analysis, and you can have the full multi-hazard probabilistic risk analysis.
Edward, can you please help manage the time?
Wrap up?
Yeah, wrap up, please.
Okay, so, I mean, in conclusion, data matters. I think we need to invest more in data, but I also think we need to cope with the uncertainty around data. I think risk assessments is like a toolkit. You have to choose the right assessment for the job. I think we also have to embrace this notion of riskologists. You know, you have a techno-scientific process, but you have socio-cultural processes. And in between, the systems approach needs to really have these riskologists, if you like, that understand how to frame those questions, where the risk is created, who is owning it. And ultimately, it's about changing the mindset or the culture of future generations. I think, you know, ourselves as professionals, policymakers, and leaders can talk about a culture of resilience, but the next generation of town planners needs to grow up with it. You know, when I grew up, cars didn't have seatbelts in the back seat, and it was considered kind of cool and slightly rebellious not to wear one. Now you're just a fool if you don't put your seatbelt on. And I think there's a sort of a mentality about town planning that needs to have the same kind of mindset shift, where future town planners are equipped with the tools, equipped with the ideas. And this is what we've been doing at something called the Resilience Academy, where students are participating in completing the risk assessment job in real-world projects with the storm drainage system of Dar es Salaam in this case, using the mobile phone, using community perceptions, using OpenStreetMap to populate risk information, risk hazards as part of the project. As interns, so we're deploying 300 students per year over a 5-year program, hoping to create 1,500 town planners in risk information, as well as trying to learn about new technologies. So we heard this morning there's a revolution in sensors, in mapping, in satellites, even in drones. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Professor Ravi.
Thank you. I would like to give a very brief discussion, primarily focusing on whom we are doing risk assessment. There have been outstanding presentations earlier in this session about the various tools available and what are the kinds of data which we want. But at the same time, while we do it, we do have to recognize that there are multiple constituencies of people who need risk assessment. So what is it that we are trying to do in risk assessment, and what are these considerations from the users which we need to keep in mind? So if we just look at risk assessment of for infrastructure, then the conventional considerations, what was going on, say, for many, many years from the 1990s until the late 2000s, for example, was to evaluate the direct and the indirect risk of damage due to various hazards, the risk of loss of functionality, to do things like evaluate downtime and the time required to restore damage. And we saw the presentation by Bilal regarding the various rate effects which can be brought into in the assessment. And most of the effort continued to be strongly focused on physical assets, on the physical infrastructure, like the roads, the bridges, the ports, and so on. And then for the last decade or so, and this is an ongoing process, we have what we can consider as the emerging risk assessment, where we look at not just the asset, but look at the system of the asset. For example, a road network, for example, so are there alternative routes which are likely to be available? For example, other kinds of power networks and so on. So can there be a sense of prioritization with a degraded system, and how can that be used for a more optimal cost-benefit assessment? Which means that we have moved into looking at both the duration as well as the degraded impact, the impact of degradation. and the indirect impact has come in now more explicitly. We are able to assess, particularly in economic terms, in terms of the losses, we are able to assess what are the kinds of impact for a system level damage because of various hazards. And this is basically where we are. But if we look into the real needs of the, look at the real needs of the user community, then we also need to now move forward to what I call as a future risk assessment. So need to consider the interplay between the cyber physical, and the physical infrastructure. So just to give one simple example, the banking system is what greases the wheels of economy in any major country of the world. Today, as in the middle of the second decade of 21st century, the banking system is almost entirely a cyber system. So how much is the risk to that system because of both natural or man-made incidences? What are our recovery systems in place? What impact would it have, not just in the economy, but on the nation's well-being as a whole? These are now becoming far more important to look at compared to any time in the past. We need to look at the impact on the reputation and competitiveness of the affected region. So how much do we invest, not just for economic recovery, but also in terms of, say, the reputation or the sense of pride which the people feel in their countries? How is it going to impact our goals which we are committed as part of the SDGs? The other impacts, so for example, the social factors which may come in, are they going to make social disparities worse? Are they going to make economic disparities worse? Are these acceptable political outcomes out of our risk management strategies? These are all becoming now far more important than they were ever in the past. And there are many reasons for that. One is that our economy is moving very rapidly and transforming from a fiscal economy to a you can say like a cyber physical economy or even a cyber economy. And secondly, the world is far more interconnected. Small pockets of people at great disadvantage were not affecting the social well-being of the whole in the same way as it happens today. So if you look at it all together, then this is how we have moved in the last 25 years from the direct and indirect impact on specific assets to impact on system. And going forward, we need to be able to develop tools and methods to advise the people on the impact of disaster on sustainability and the impact on society as a whole. Obviously, this is going to be a multidisciplinary task. This is not going to have unique solutions or unique methodologies. And this is not even going to have inputs which are easily quantifiable. And these are all challenges which we are looking at. But if we just consider in any given any major country, if we just look at the decision making on a day-to-day basis on any issue of importance, the decision making is having the same kind of uncertainty of inputs, having the same kind of uncertainty on the impacts, and having the same kind of uncertainty on the outcomes. So it's not so different from what's already happening, except that now it can be in a more formal way. The solutions and the outcomes of the modeling can be used for a more calibrated information to the people who have to take the decisions. So the question is, who are those decision makers? So the risk assessment should be closely related to the purpose and the intended use for that risk assessment. And an important constituency, of course, are the professionals, the planners, and people, say, in the field of insurance and reinsurance. But that is only a particular set of people. We need to have very sophisticated scientific methods so that they can withstand the
Excuse
scrutiny
me,
of peers.
Professor,
Yeah.
you need to wrap up.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
And we have both probabilistic and scenario-based methods which are already in place. But the risk assessment needs to be more closely aligned with the requirement of the users. And I'll just give an example of the conventional risk assessments. So they need to cater to the needs of the disaster management communities, the governments, and the society at large. But when we move to emerging risk assessment, these same communities need other kinds of information which are also now slowly coming in. But when we look at future risk assessment, then we need to facilitate implementation of the SDGs, to provide metrics for implementation of Sendai framework, incorporate effect of new risks such as climate change, and incorporate impact of cyber infrastructure in the economies. So what are the key challenges in terms of developing indicators is that it should provide paradigms for performance-based risk assessment, include metrics to link disaster resilience and sustainable development, and incorporate effects of climate change, urbanization, the so-called Industry 4.0, and cyber economy. So if I can quickly summarize, in the last 20 years or so, we have a very solid foundation for risk assessment of physical infrastructure. And we now need to develop a more holistic framework which is based on resilience and which considers the emerging risks. And we also need to recognize that all risks, even with the best risk assessment, cannot be eliminated. So we need to have the framework advise on how to define acceptable risks, and also to guide optimal combination of the finances and efforts by the government as well as the non-government players. So what it comes to is that the past experience alone cannot be a guide to take the decisions of the future. The future is very different from the past, so the strategies which we have to take also has to recognize that and be suitably fine-tuned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were a couple of interests from some of the countries to relate their experience. We will start with a brief 5-minute remark by Chile.
Good afternoon for all of them. I promise you be brief. First of all, I was thanks for the invitation to the UNES ISDR and the government of India, and I'm part of the National Emergency Office from Chile, and I would like to tell you about our experience. First of all, some dates about Chile. Chile is a large coast and has territory even in the Antarctic territory. And we have exposed to different kind of events, meteorological events, earthquake, tsunamis, volcanoes, and fire, forest fire, etc. And until from 2010, when was have a big earthquake and tsunami, we have events from twice events from every year. So if you see the table, you can see the earthquake and tsunami of 2010 has required more than $6 billion for rehabilitation, emergency, and reconstruction for the last 6 years. From 2000, Chile has improved their system, civil protection system. In 2002, and yes, Chile was approved the National Civil Protection Plan. In 2011, Chile was approved the National Policy of Disaster Risk Reduction. In 2012, Chile established a national platform for disaster risk, for to improve or for to help to NEMI, the Emergency National Office, for to coordinate the civil protection system. And finally, in 2015, Chile approved the National Strategic Plan. This plan has 5 priorities actions. One of them is related with the topics we are studying now, is the reducing underlying risk factor. Under activity, we have 4 strategic objectives. One of them is identify and define underlying risk factor. Second, identify and develop measurements for to keep the operational continuity for critical infrastructure and public services. 3, develop a strategic of risk transfer mechanisms. And 4, to keep updated technical standards and normative about infrastructure. What we are doing in every one of these objectives. First, last year, we developed a methodology for the local governments can identify the underlying risk factor. This methodology is applied by a survey. This survey defined the risk of the every local level, and these results are improve or means a set of recommendations that the local levels can be applied. About the operational continuity, we developed a methodology that Mrs. Sorieta Valdez told you later is for the public project infrastructure. And the third time, about the risk transfer, last year was created a task group for collect local information about financing for disasters and emergency, and propose some risk transfer strategy. And 4, about technical standards and normative, we are improve the national seismic network for to collect data, for to better or improve the technical standards.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be so quick, but I want to show you how to develop the disaster resilient infrastructure and how we've been working in Chile about that. So the Chilean strategy was focused in incorporating the disaster risk assessment as part of the investment approval process. And you can see all the process, and we're focused in the pre-investment process for doing probabilistic risk management. So the Ministry of Social Development has developed a supplementary methodology to reduce disaster risk in public investment, integrating this disaster risk assessment in infrastructure public investment process. So the structure of the supplementary methodology has 4 steps. The first step is hazard analysis. The second one is the risk evaluation. The third one is identify risk management strategies or alternatives. And finally, to select the best risk management strategy. So the first step, the hazard analysis, we have different tools. I'm not going to talk about all the tools, but just I want to show that we got two main tools. The first one is the web viewer, Chile Preparado from ONEMI, and you can get in here, where it says ingresa al visor aquí. Then you can see some hazards. Hazards about forest fire and volcanic eruption and tsunami. And then for check landslide, we got this checklist. The second step, if we found any hazard in the territory, so we have to evaluate that risk. So for that, we develop a multi-criterial analysis for estimate the disaster risk index. This index is developed, or we can estimate this index by identify the hazard, vulnerability, and resilience. So we got 4 forms for facilitate the assessment of the risk, and the hazards are forest fires, volcanic eruption, tsunamis, and landslides. And each form integrates exposure to hazard with the vulnerability analysis. And here, I'm gonna tell you all the model, but maybe later I can send you the methodology if you like. And well, and we incorporate as well components of resilience analysis. The forms are developed in Excel, so it's easier for everyone to check the risk, and you can estimate quickly the disaster risk index and obtain then the disaster risk report here. So, well, the third step is check if we have to develop some managed strategy. For that, we had to see if the project exceeds the tolerance level. We estimate with a model the tolerance level. So if the index is upon this tolerance level, so we have to manage and identify a list of strategies to reduce the disaster risk. So here we can evaluate the strategy, we can describe here, and then we can obtain the index for the strategy. Finally, we can select the best strategy or the convenient economy strategy, and that. Well, this supplement methodology allows focusing on have resilient infrastructure and well have also sustainable and resilient public infrastructure, which allows us to have continuity of the service and quick restoration of service after any disaster. And also making prospective risk management in infrastructure, and that will contribute to the SDG for resilient infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation, and the tool that you've developed is very intriguing as to how it is working, how you not just measure risk, but also see the effect of risk reduction measures in the risk index. This is something which would be of great interest to us and have a more in-depth dialogue. So there was also a request from UK to talk about how they do national level risk assessment in UK. So let's hear from them.
Good afternoon. Thank you, NDMA, for the invitation to be here. It's a privilege to be able to understand and share experience, and I'm here to talk about how the UK assesses risk to its critical national infrastructure. I'll try very much to keep to the 5 minutes prescribed, and do stop me if I go over. So by way of a brief introduction, my name is Anika Adonai. I'm a policy advisor within the Critical National Infrastructure Team within the Civil Contingency Secretariat. For those of you who are a bit unfamiliar with the Secretariat, our primary objective is to support the UK Prime Minister in ensuring that we have the capability to be able to prepare for, respond and recover from civil emergencies or civil disasters in this context. The work of the Secretariat is domestic in its function. However, we conduct a variety of different activities. The first being that we produce the National Risk Assessment every 2 years, which looks at threats and hazards to the UK. We also develop doctrines and standards in the area of local and national resilience. And some of you may be familiar with this particular mechanism, but we control and coordinate the government's response during civil emergencies through the Cabinet Office briefing rooms, also known as COBRA. So the question today is, how do we assess risk to our critical national infrastructure? I think fairly useful, although I know from the German example it's been defined already, but I'll give you what we define as critical national infrastructure. We see it as assets, systems, and buildings which are essential to the smooth running of the UK and which, if disrupted, would have a detrimental impact on either the environment, human welfare, security, or financial systems of the UK. In the UK, we divide our C&I into 13 critical sectors. I won't go through all of them, but there may be some overlaps in some of your countries. We have energy, we have water, telecoms, civil, nuclear, and very similar to the German example, the Cabinet Office, which is a department that I work in, which is in the Civil Contingency Secretariat comes under, has the coordination role. So it brings the sectors together and has overall responsibility for coordinating resilience activity over the sectors. However, we also have lead government departments who are responsible for managing the day-to-day risk and mitigating the risk within their particular sectors. So an example would be that the Department for Energy and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, has responsibility over the water sectors, and it works to manage risk in its particular area. So back to the risk assessment. There's two key products that we use to assess risk to our infrastructure. The first I mentioned at the beginning, which is the National Risk Assessment. It's produced every 2 years. It's a classified document, but we also produce the National Risk Register, which is the public version of the report. And it's really useful in terms of making sure that our public is alert but not unduly alarmed to the risks that we face. So the risk assessment process looks at threats and hazards which has the potential to impact the UK over a period of 5 years. It's important to note that it's not just a long list of any kind of risk. There's a particular process and methodology behind it, which means that these risks sit on the board. In the risk assessment, it assesses both impact and plausibility. Impact and likelihood, my apologies, if we're talking about hazards. And on the impact scales, it's looking at impact to human life, it's talking about disruption to essential services, it's looking at fatalities, casualties, amongst many other things. What's quite interesting about the UK risk assessment process is that we develop worst case scenarios which fit onto the scale. And the idea behind it being that these scenarios are severe enough, but they're plausible manifestations of what could happen. And what's really useful about these worst case scenarios and their comparison is that we're then able to use them to make sure that we've got the proper planning and capability in place in response to civil emergencies. The second product, which I didn't get round to mention at the beginning, is the sector security resilience plans. Now, these particular plans are specific to infrastructure, and they look at the resilience of our infrastructure in relation to some of the risks identified in the UK. These SSRPs, which is our acronym, are produced every year, and they're used in both industry and within the government as a way of planning for civil emergencies. So I've spoken about the NRA and I've spoken about the SSRPs. Why are these things important? Well, the first thing is that the SSRPs brings to the attention, both within government and outside of government, what are the key risks that we face. It's a great way of being able to communicate to the public, and it's a great way to be able to bring it to the attention of our ministers and of the people who have the power to make the right decisions and begin investing in the areas that need to develop resilience. So what are the strengths? I mean, just to conclude, because I know that my time is short, I wanted to discuss some of the brief challenges and the strengths to our model. I'd say one of the strengths is that we, as the Cabinet Office, bring different sectors together. We bring the water sector together, the energy sector together. We get them thinking, we get them speaking. It's a collaborative way of working. And we always talk about interdependencies and how difficult it is, and that's very true. And one of the things that we try to do is have industry forums where we can get the sectors speaking to each other and trying to mitigate against this. Another strength, I'd say, to our system, without a doubt, is communicating to the public. So making sure that we communicate our assessment of risk, both at the national and at the local level. Yes, we have the national risk assessment, but the UK varies from region to region, and it's important to have local manifestations of the risk assessment that people can know and be able to do things about. If you think about any kind of national disaster, yes, the government has a key role. However, most of the first responders will be at a local level, so it's important that they stay abreast of what's going on and that they know the risks that their particular infrastructure or region faces. I'd say a kind of challenge or something that we are constantly thinking of ways that we can improve is definitely trying to understand the risk appetite of industry owners. In the UK, critical national infrastructure, the majority of which is owned by the private sector, and they may be more tolerant of certain risks than we ordinarily would be. So the question is, how do we engage them in a way that can bring them on side, that can get them to understand and see the importance of resilience? And that's definitely a key factor for us. I'd say a final challenge would be preparing for the unknown unknown. In the UK, we're well-versed, we're well-practiced at responding to floods. It's a risk that occurs and we see almost on a yearly basis, but one of the things that we have trepidation about is that unknown risk that's not on the list, and that's a concern for us. So yeah, that was a very brief presentation. I hope that was useful to you, but I'm happy to explain in a bit more detail to anyone who's interested in the breakout areas, either later on at dinner or tomorrow at lunch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You made very effective use of 5 minutes. You talked about 2 kinds of risk assessment, classified, public-facing, 2 key challenges, 2 key strengths, very interesting. I think particularly the public communication side of it is very interesting, how you use risk assessment to enhance awareness of the public and create demand for risk reduction actions. So we are getting to the end of the day. We can take a few questions to the panelists, and then I'll give all the panelists a chance before handing it over to the chair. Case.
Thank you for the very interesting presentations and overviews of risk assessment methodologies.
Let's go.
They are key for making risk-informed decision-making makers. They are key for risk-informed reporting on progress. They are key to communicate. I wonder if the panelists have experienced whether these methodologies that have been presented are good enough for investors to decide on their risks for investment in infrastructure, or do we need something in addition?
Question, if I could repeat, Case's question is that a number of models assessing risk and resilience have been presented, but your question is that are they good enough for investors to base their investment decision making? Any other questions? Dr. Vatsa.
This question is addressed to Professor Bilal. Ayyub, I think his presentation on the risk and recovery as it spanned out in Katrina was elegant. How does it square with the actual experience of recovery in Katrina? What do you learn? How do you modify your risk assessment, your recovery scenario on the basis of what you have learned in course of recovery in Katrina?
I think we can take one more question before we hand it over to the Dr. Michael Ernst.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Michael Ernst. I'm with USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. And one of the things, and I think it's a lot of you have touched upon these issues of different levels of capacity and then and quite a bit of technical sophistication and possibilities. One of the big challenges that many countries in the developing world are getting considerable capacity at the high level and understand these things, can come to these conferences and present and are doing tremendous work. But as it goes down to the local levels of government, the sophistication and that capacity diminishes very dramatically. And you've talked about there's been some talk about some checklists, that type of thing. And this intriguing talk about the idea of training urban planners that can go out to the municipalities. So these pieces, I guess one thing that would be useful to understand is there some way, some sort of framework we can give a government sort of at the national level in a way to help empower down to the local municipal level where the municipal challenges are very broad, their lifestyle, their quality of life, transportation, it's all these things we put under infrastructure that are service provision. But there's also a need to make sure that people understand their own infrastructure, that it's something that gets them elected. They have to be able to do a lot of competing interests, and it goes far beyond just a resilience cross-cutting issue. That's not the priority for most of them. How can we sort of put together a framework that supports them in meeting all of those different needs that includes resilience and feeds in and takes advantage of some of the capacity that tends to be higher up in the national system?
Thank you very much, Michael. With those three questions, maybe I can start from my right. Professor Bilal, Ayyub, please try to be brief and address the questions. You can pick and choose. There is no question specifically addressed to you except Dr. Krishnawitz's question.
Yes, I'd like to thank the gentleman for the question. Let me restate the question just to make sure that I have the right understanding. What are the lessons learned related to risk assessment based on what was done for Katrina, after Katrina? Just as background, I was the lead risk analyst when the model was developed for the Army Corps of Engineers. What we found, we had very short, tight schedule, 1 year, and what we found is very little information about the system. We had actually to send surveyors to determine the elevation of levees. We had to sample geotech related information. We had to characterize the pumping station systems as well as the drainage and so on. And for me, a key lesson learned, when we have such a critical infrastructure, I think those analyses should be done before an event happens. We should have done it, we should examine it, and so on. But the hurricane protection system of New Orleans has a unique history. It was not built by the Army Corps. It was built by various districts, and they were not engineered levees. They were actually pile up of dirt, and then the Army Corps took over the project, and they never really examined it holistically as a system. I'll say after the risk analysis, tremendous enhancements were done in the system, not only on the strength and the integrity of the system, but also in modeling hurricanes and simulation on the analytical side as well. And this will be, and the outcome from it has been beneficial globally.
Professor Ravi, any comments from you?
So I'll touch upon the first and the third query regarding are risk assessments good enough for investors? So the risk assessment techniques are fairly sophisticated now, and there is a considerable capacity in most parts of the world to carry out these assessments. So in a way, they are quite good for investment decisions. What they are perhaps not good are for, say, policy-making decisions and political decisions. So a lot more sophistication has to come over there compared to taking financial decisions. The last question was regarding how to transmit the risk assessment knowledge to the local level. So how can this be made more useful? And this is really like a holy grail for the risk assessment or risk management community, that how do you have the people most in need of knowledge get the right knowledge at the right time with the right investment in their time. And there's really, I'm not aware of any working model in any domain which is successfully showing this time and again. So I think this is like an open area where we have to innovate, we have to try various things and come up with something which is workable in various situations. Right now I cannot foresee any of these things based on what we have been able to do globally in different parts of the world in the past experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add on maybe the third question, when it comes to preparedness and response, so it's local communities and local governments that are the first responders, right? So there's certainly a role for risk assessment that's fit for that purpose. The question is, as you rightly say, capacity is weak, assistance is limited. So we've been trying to sort of modify processes from participatory decision making that happens in villages towards participatory risk management planning. And you get this in Pacific Island communities. I've seen and worked with community infrastructure management plans that are quite good, and they can be readily modified to be risk sensitized, if you like. So in Dar es Salaam, what we're really trying to do is connect that community participatory decision making to municipal revenue collection, frankly. And I think that's the driver, the day-to-day function of the city in places that are growing so fast. And Dar es Salaam is 5.5% a year, I think, but some neighborhoods are 10, 15% a year. It's all about property mapping for own source revenue collection, but collecting data on those properties is a core part of the risk assessment. So in that case, you find that local governments actually have an advantage over central government because they are the first ones to produce those hyper-local maps. How to use that is where I think we have to innovate. I mean, you cannot expect them to maintain a GIS team and sort of core analytics. So we're talking about very low cost, low complexity digital information. And in the ward offices, it's very much paper maps and handwritten comments from the community members. But we do have a lot of traction. I think it's not impossible.
Yeah, just to answer the very specific question on using risk information to guide investment. The metrics which we've worked on are used by the Economist Intelligence Unit. They've actually built an index out of those metrics and are starting to incorporate it into their country risk reports. So I think that is actually promising, because if you can actually influence investment flows, that can have huge sort of downstream impacts on actually what our resilience looks like in the future. Regarding Michael Ernst's question, I still think that's one of the biggest questions we haven't answered, already discussed around the table. To what extent can we actually have a sort of, let's say, a systematic or systemic approach to this? Or to what extent do we have to be content, in a sense, with small victories? Is our approach more like a guerrilla warfare approach, or is it more like a sort of a war of positions approach? And certainly in most of the countries I've worked in, going back into probabilities, the probabilities of actually being able to assure a level of coordination across sectors between central and local governments, between government, private sector and civil society, and to maintain that coordination for long enough with enough stability that anything can be achieved is pretty close to a 1 in 100,000 possibility. So maybe it is, I think, in many countries better to think more of a sort of guerrilla warfare approach of actually trying to make specific bits or sectors of infrastructure in specific regions resilient and try and knit something together from the bottom up. And one last point, which I think has been absent from all the presentations, it was certainly absent from mine, but I haven't seen it in the others, which I think we really should be asking ourselves, and it comes back to this question of really who owns the risk. Risk is a relationship. It has a subject and an object. It's not an objective. It's not a thing. There's always someone who's at risk to something. So I think we also need to look at this when we do our cost-benefit analysis, we have to do this from a social perspective. I mean, who's actually absorbing the costs and who's getting the benefits? How many governments are actually willing to invest a lot in disaster control infrastructure to protect informal settlements? In which case, the benefit would go to the informal settlements, the cost would go to the central government. How many governments are willing to, say, eradicate informal settlements to build new disaster control infrastructure to protect something else? In which case, the cost goes to the informal settlements and the benefit goes to someone else. So, in all our discussions today, for me, this has been, in a sense, at least one of the elephants in the room that no one's touched on, which is really, the social and the political economy aspect of making infrastructure resilient, and who is actually the winners and who are the losers in that process. So I'll just end on that one.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I will not try to summarize this session. We've been exposed to a lot today, so I will just ask the chair to conclude this session.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure we have had a very fruitful session just now, and thank you very much to Kamal for facilitating this session, and I guess a round of applause is due for the panelists. Thank you.
Chair and co-chair for maneuvering the session with ease. The cross-cutting panel discussion has been moved to tomorrow morning as the first session. Before we proceed to the last issue, I have two announcements to make. One, the delegates from Andhra Pradesh, NCRPB and Uttarakhand may kindly meet me before leaving. Secondly, a bus has been arranged to ply the delegates to official dinner venue. All invited delegates are requested to kindly reach the hotel lobby sharp at 7 p.m. In the end, I request Sri Kamal Kishore NDMA to kindly wrap up the day's proceeding.
This will be the briefest wrap-up ever of any 8 hours of discussions. Basically, there was a lot this morning at the opening session, the stage-setting presentation. Then we looked at disaster control infrastructure. We looked at energy and transportation. And now we thematically looked at risk assessments. I see that there were 4 big takeaways from the day. I think the whole day, especially the earlier part, was a phrase which kept coming up again and again, was this notion of system of systems, how do we assess risk? And in his presentation, Andrew sort of contested the utility of that approach for all countries. For some countries it may be useful, for others it may be, he used the analogy of a Rolls-Royce engine in a Mini. So the jury is out on that. So you have a traditional approach of doing risk assessment, and you have a highly sophisticated approach of doing a system of systems analysis of consequences of future hazards, and you have everything in between. So I think this is something we have to grapple with as we develop our work in the future. The second thing which is very interesting is beginning to sort of make the notion of resilience a little bit more quantified. I think Professor Bilal Ayyub's presentation talking about how to quantify resilience, how to measure it in objective terms, and then set targets as to what is the kind of resilience you wish to achieve for different kinds of infrastructure, and linking that with recovery targets and all of that. So I think that second bunch of ideas is also very, very useful to sort of pursue further. The third point, the third takeaway from the day is the session on standards is tomorrow, but we are already beginning to get into standards. That there is no universal standard. There is a lot that goes into how you set standards. Risk assessments, the has to be a basis for standards, the development context, the affordability, the risk appetite has to be taken into account in looking at what is the kind of standards we go for in different infrastructure sectors. It's a complex area which requires much deeper discussion as well. And finally, all through the discussions, the issue of capacity at different levels. Dr. Michael Ernst in this session talked about the fact that, we at some points we feel that we have a lot of capacity, but that capacity tends to stay at the national, international, sometimes subnational level. As soon as we go at the local level, the capacity drops exponentially. So how are we going to be able to deal with that? We don't want to just get excited by a lot of sophisticated technical discussion, which we don't have the capacity to use to deliver results for the people who seek to serve. With these 4 points and the elephant in the room that Andrew introduced, whose risk, whose resilience, who pays, who benefits in building a resilience. I think the issues of equity, equality, I'm always confused about these things, is an extremely important one as well. If the overarching theme of the sustainable development goals is leave no one behind, we cannot ignore the elephant in the room. With that, thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
Thank you everyone, and tomorrow morning we will start at 9:30 a.m.